Dr. Dana Tassone here with participants in HFT6228, a graduate course in hospitality management, discussing Chapter 3. This chapter is historical in nature, and some people like history, some people don't. But what it does is, or what it's intended to do, is it's intended to show us why we do the things we do today, and maybe even guess about the things we'll do tomorrow or in the future. And it highlights two things, two main things. It highlights the internal organizational environment, and it highlights the external environment. And you know that that anything strategic, and all management is strategic. Human resource management is strategic. Anything strategic needs to consider those two environments, the inside environment and the outside environment. And why? Because the organization is a microcosm of a macrocosm. What's the macrocosm? The macrocosm is the environment, in this case, society. So an organization is interdependent upon society. And within that microcosm called an organization, inside of it, you have individuals. And if you needed to define what an organization is, it could be said that an organization is the collection of individuals for a common purpose. And if that's true, and if individuals are really people, then an organization is an organic entity, because it's nothing more than people brought together for a common purpose. So the individual is the microcosm of the organization. The organization is a microcosm of the environment in the society. So we first look inside and then we look outside, but the reason for this conversation is that all things are interdependent, and we need to consider when strategizing both internal mechanisms as well as external mechanisms. And there is a school of thought that focuses, it's a group of scholars that focus solely on the aspect of management history. They're called, interestingly, management historians. And as a matter of fact, they comprise a relatively large division within the eminent professional association called the Academy of Management. And these are individuals, mostly old people, who have spent their entire careers studying the history of management. So what we do is we present in the chapter, and you've seen it already, a figure that gives a very, very brief description of the evolution of management. From its inception in the 1920s, Industrial Revolution, in this country, in the United States, in this country, through the current day, the 2000s. And those who are those colleagues who are business school grads, they will enjoy the brevity of this description, because in business school this is discussed ad nauseum, and there are sets and subsets of the subsets and subsets, and there are a professor can drone forever just on the history of management evolution. So why is it important? Is it history just for the sake of history? Of course not. It's evolution, evolving. So, and as I've mentioned before, I'm not going to read the chapter to you or even rehash it for you, but we started with the first school of management really was from the field of engineering. The people in what we call scientific management were engineers by training. And engineering, in those days, was a mechanical process. And on its higher level, it was a systems process. So we have individuals, large numbers of individuals, performing tasks. And anybody who's a systems person, like an engineer, would look at something like this and want to improve it. And that's in fact what a small number of people did. That was the first school of management. It was called scientific management, and Frederick Taylor is called the father of it. And there was an interesting couple, Frank and Lillian Gilbreth, who also pursued that line of study. Now here's the thing. In scientific management, there's no discussion of human factors. We're just looking at engineering factors. But interestingly, at the same time, during those years, another study was done called the Hawthorne Studies, and this was an individual who was looking from an engineering standpoint originally at the work of a group of ladies in a dingy room, and this person, as the book tells you, was hired by a light company, and what that person wanted to prove or demonstrate through his research was that as lighting increases, so does productivity. In those days, productivity really was nothing more than efficiency, which is just getting more with less money at that time. And as the story goes, when he raised the lights, productivity went up. When he dimmed the lights, productivity still went up. But what was wrong? And what was learned is that these individuals in this room were getting attention from some research type person in a white coat, looked important, and that attention was causing them to be motivated to enhance their output. So what that did, and the guy's name was Elton Mayo, and what that did is it launched a school of thought that died really quickly, called the human relations model of management. But interesting, because so now by the 1930s, there were two schools of thought already, an engineering school of thought and a humanistic school of thought. So we move into the 40s. 40s were World War II. We required some scientific means to plan, chart, and evaluate complex operations, Beach of Normandy, and all of those things. And that gave rise, and so this called upon a new group of people, and they were scientists, and they employed the scientific method to the field of management in complex operations, and that became management science, not scientific management, but management science. From the 40s, we push forward 20, 30 years maybe, and now the behavioral scientists start to become popular in the management scene, and we start to pay attention to behaviors of individuals within organizations, both individual behaviors as well as group behaviors, which have totally different dynamics. And so now we see a movement toward behavioral science, and that continued into the 70s. And then that evolved, and interesting, because this brings us to the 1980s, when, guess what happened? Human resource management became the big buzz. Human capital, individuals being treated as assets worthy of investment and development. And so this school of thought emerged as a blend of behavioral science and management systems, but limited at that point. Well, it didn't take long. Now we come to a point where we're really looking at systems management. So anytime we see a line, of course, we always think, okay, there was one thing and then this thing, so everything's mutually exclusive. And as you've proven in your discussions, you know that's not true. We still see the engineering aspect, scientific management still alive. We do still see management science still alive. Obviously, the behavioral sciences are very, very alive. And so it really boils down into two things: systems and people. Put them together, and we have systems management. And I believe that, and I got to tell you, people come up with new buzzwords all the time. Researchers, coming up with new terminologies, but they do continue to do so, especially in the hospitality field. But what it will boil down to, what it still boils down to today, is everything is a system. If you recall the model we shared in chapter 2, I guess it was, the productivity model showed a linear progression, inputs, transformation process, and outputs. Well, there were two circles around those, right? And one circle was called the meaning system, invisible system of meaning. What's that? That's the organizational culture. And the bottom circle was the learning system. And what's that? That's human development. So culture is people-based. Learning is people-based. And so we have this system, and it's wrapped with these invisible forces called people forces. Culture is people. What's a culture? A culture is the values, attitudes, and beliefs of the individuals within the organization collectively over time. They establish what becomes the culture of an organization, the values, attitudes, and beliefs of the organization. What's an organization? It's a collection of individuals brought together for a common purpose. And, so that culture is what? That culture is the society, the microcosm society within an organization. And that organization, again, is part of the macro, and the macro being the society in general. So, speaking of society, did a little thing about the early days of capitalism, the early days of the requirement for labor, talked a little bit about the pre-assembly line era, talked about artisans and craftspeople. And interestingly, and we learned that one of the things that came over from Britain was the concept of common law, or case law, or tort law. And the story. It was begun in early England when individuals who are our equivalent of judges, called chanceries, would hear a case that involved a dispute between one party and another party. They would keep a record of that dispute, and that record would be applied to similar cases thereafter. And the concept between employers and employees, the precedent, if you will, the establishment from case law, employers and employees, became known as the employment at will doctrine. And you've already identified that there's a big difference between that and a right to work doctrine that exists in certain states, mostly in the South, Southeast. A lot of people confuse that, but you've proven otherwise. So the issue, of course, that we've been discussing is, the EAW, employment at will. Does EAW still make sense? And if we were to, go into it deeply, we just provided an overview. But if we went into it deeply, and we will get more into that topic, and we will identify specifics about that. But right now, we don't know much. When you don't know much, you get to generalize. So, from a generalization standpoint, it is an eroding doctrine, which means it doesn't make as much sense as it did in the early days. And the question is why? And the answer is the power balance between employees and employers has changed, because employers employ many, many people, and so the power has shifted a little bit. And for that reason, very few states still uphold the employment at will doctrine, and those that do do it in a fashion that is very, very narrow. Employment at will used to be like this. Employment at will now is like this. But it does still exist. It does exist in Florida, as a matter of fact. I believe there's still 9 states that recognize it. But why is it narrow? There are a zillion exceptions, and I'm pretty sure we're going to talk about that in the next chapter. And so then we moved along, and what did we do? Everything else we discussed was really just a lead-in to where we are at the current time. So suffice to say that there has been an evolution in the field of management. Suffice to say that, as we already discussed, the human resource movement, which is taking the people management business and putting it at the level of strategic management within a firm, strategic direction in the firm, occurred in the 1980s. That it is still present to this day, and in reality, as you know, in sound organizations, it maintains a very high status. In less people-oriented industries, as we have discussed, it has less of a status. The first vignette we talked about in Chapter 1, that was an organization where it isn't going to get a strong HR person and won't have empowerment of that person and won't have systems in place to enhance or ensure the investment in human capital. But when we look at the good stories, and we look at the stories of sound companies, large firms mostly, we see that the opposite is true, that the HR officer is, in fact, at the executive level of the organization and does impact the strategic direction of the firm. Here's an interesting little point that I learned in my past. This was maybe 30 years ago. Scientific management, which we all know about. Most people don't, So back in the 80s, there was a company, a large consulting firm, and they one of the key things of scientific management was time and motion studies. Well, some company, I don't recall the name exactly, but some company packaged this and sold it as an efficiency tool to the Marriott organization, made a ton of money. For years and years and years, they would go in with a stopwatch and a clipboard, and they would do these time and motion studies and come up with things we've known for a zillion years on how to improve efficiency. And that's the thing to remember about early engineering approaches to management too. They were all efficiency-based, not effectiveness-based, because effectiveness was a given in those days. Quality was not an issue. It was all about saving money. I think we're out of time, and so that's a little insight to Chapter 3. See you in the next